The day they drove her off the land, the wind did not blow. It stood still, as if even the sky was watching and holding its breath. The wagon tracks cut deep into the dry earth, and the dust hung in the air long after the men had gone. She stood there alone, hands clenched in her worn shawl, staring at the place that had once been hers. A small patch of soil, a leaning fence, a home that never had much but had been enough. Now it was nothing but a memory fading under the weight of silence. She did not cry. Not then. People said the frontier made a person hard, but that was not true. It did something quieter. It took the softness and buried it deep, where no one could see it, not even the person carrying it. She bent down, scooped up a handful of dirt, and let it fall through her fingers. The soil was dry, stubborn, like everything else in that part of the country. It had taken years to coax even a little life from it, years she would never get back. The men had not looked her in the eye when they told her to leave. Papers had changed hands somewhere far away, and that was enough. Land was not about sweat or memory. It was about signatures. She had learned that too late. By nightfall she had gathered what she could carry. A few sacks of grain, some tools, a blanket worn thin by winters, and a small lantern. The rest she left behind. There was no use holding on to things that could not follow her. The road ahead stretched long and uncertain, disappearing into hills that grew darker with every step. She walked until her legs trembled and her breath came in sharp pulls. The land rose slowly, turning rough and uneven. Rocks jutted from the ground like broken teeth, and the grass grew thin and wild. It was not a place people chose to settle. That was why she kept going. No one would come looking for her there. It was near dusk when she found the cave. At first, it was just a shadow in the side of a hill, half hidden by scrub and stone. She might have passed it by if she had not been so tired, but something about it called to her. Maybe it was the way the air felt cooler near its mouth, or the way the earth around it seemed undisturbed. She stepped closer, peering into the darkness. The cave was deeper than she expected. The walls curved inward, forming a natural shelter from the wind. The ground inside was dry, packed firm. It smelled of stone and earth, untouched by the harshness outside. She stood there for a long moment, listening. No sound came from within. No sign of animals or danger, just quiet. It was not a home. Not by any measure she had known. But it was something. That night, she made a small fire near the entrance, careful to keep it low. The flames flickered against the cave walls, casting shadows that moved like restless spirits. She wrapped herself in her blanket and sat close to the warmth, her eyes fixed on the dark beyond. Every crackle of the fire, every whisper of wind outside made her tense. Sleep came in short, uneasy moments. By morning, the cold had settled deep into her bones. Winter was coming. She could feel it in the air, in the way the sky stretched pale and distant. Out there, on the open land, winter meant hunger. It meant nights that felt endless and days that gave nothing back. She had seen what it did to people. She had buried neighbors who had not made it through. She would not be one of them. The cave gave her an idea that seemed foolish at first. Maybe it was the kind of thought that came only when there were no other choices left. She stepped outside and looked at the patch of ground just inside the cave's mouth. It caught a sliver of sunlight during the day. Not much, but enough to warm the soil slightly. She went back to her sacks and untied one slowly. Inside was wheat grain, saved from her last harvest. It was meant for food, for survival through the cold months. Planting it now would be a risk, maybe a mistake. Her hands hovered over the grain. If she ate it, it would last a while, not long enough. If she planted it, there was a chance, small and uncertain, that it might grow. A chance that the cave, with its shelter and warmth, could hold something living through the winter. She had always been told wheat needed open fields, wide skies, steady sun. This place had none of that. Just stone, shadow, and a stubborn piece of earth. But she had learned something else too. The land did not always follow the rules people set for it. She spent the day clearing the ground inside the cave's entrance. She dug into the soil with her hands and tools, breaking up the hard surface, pulling out stones, mixing in what little she had to soften it. It was slow work, and every movement made her muscles ache. But she did not stop. By evening, she pressed the first seeds into the earth. The act felt strange, almost defiant, as if she were daring the world to prove her wrong again. She covered the seeds carefully, patting the soil down with steady hands. Then she sat back and looked at what she had done. There was no sign of life. Just dirt. Days passed, each one colder than the last. She kept the fire going as best she could, gathering wood from the sparse land around her. The cave held the heat better than the open air, but it was never enough. At night, the wind howled outside, rattling the world beyond her shelter. Snow began to fall, light at first, then heavier, covering the ground in a thick, silent blanket. Inside, she waited. She checked the soil every morning, her breath visible in the cold air. Nothing changed. The earth remained still, unyielding. Doubt crept in, slow and persistent. Maybe she had wasted the grain. Maybe the cave was no better than the land she had lost. Hunger began to gnaw at her. She rationed what little food she had left, stretching each meal as far as she could. Her strength faded bit by bit. Some days it felt like the cold had settled not just in her body, but in her spirit. Still, she kept the fire burning. Still, she waited. One morning, when the storm outside had quieted and the world lay buried under snow, she noticed something different. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light. She leaned closer, her heart beginning to beat faster. There, breaking through the soil, was a thin, green shoot. It was small, fragile, barely more than a thread of life pushing against the weight of the earth. But it was there. She reached out, stopping just short of touching it. The sight of it stirred something deep inside her, something she had almost forgotten. Hope, quiet but steady. More shoots followed in the days after. Not many, and not strong, but enough to prove that life could take hold even in a place like this. She tended to them carefully, guarding them from the cold, feeding them what little she could spare. Outside, winter tightened its grip. Inside the cave, the wheat grew slowly, stubbornly, as if it shared her refusal to give up. The green shoots stretched upward, thin but determined, reaching for the faint light that filtered in from the cave's mouth. But the cold did not ease. The food did not last. And the nights grew longer, heavier, with a silence that pressed in from all sides. One evening, as the fire burned low and the wind began to rise again, she sat watching the fragile field she had created. The wheat swayed slightly in the faint draft, alive in a way the rest of the world seemed not to be. Her hands trembled, whether from cold or exhaustion, she could not tell. She knew the truth then, in a way she had been avoiding. The wheat was growing, yes, but it would not be ready in time. Not before the last of her strength gave out. Not before winter took what it always took. The fire flickered, casting long shadows across the cave walls. And as the wind howled outside, louder than before, she realized that surviving the winter would take more than hope, more than stubbornness. It would take something she had not yet found. The fire snapped softly, sending a thin trail of smoke toward the cave ceiling, and she sat there staring at the wheat as if it might answer her. The green shoots had grown taller over the past days, thin but steady, bending slightly whenever the cold air slipped in from outside. They were alive, and that should have been enough to lift her spirits, but it was not. Not anymore. Her stomach ached in a dull, constant way now. Hunger was no longer sharp or loud. It had settled into something quieter, something that stayed with her through every hour. She had counted what remained of her food that morning, turning the small pieces over in her hands as if they might somehow multiply. They did not. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and leaned closer to the fire. The warmth barely reached her fingers. It felt like winter had found a way inside her, deeper than the cold air, deeper than the stone walls around her. Her thoughts drifted back to the land she had lost. It had not always been dry. There had been a time, years ago, when the soil held more promise. She remembered the first season she planted wheat there, how carefully she had worked the ground, how hopeful she had been when the first green lines appeared across the field. That memory felt distant now, like something that belonged to another life. There had been a house too. Small, built by hands that were not skilled, but were determined. The roof had leaked during storms, and the walls had creaked when the wind pushed against them, but it had been hers. Every mark in the wood, every patch in the roof had a story behind it. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to hold on to that feeling. The sense of having a place in the world. It slipped away quickly, replaced by the steady sound of the wind outside the cave. She had not always been alone either. There had been neighbors scattered across the land, each one fighting their own quiet battle with the soil and the seasons. They had helped each other when they could, shared tools, traded grain, stood together when times were hard. But as the years passed and the land gave less, those bonds had begun to break. Some had left, chasing stories of better land farther west. Others had stayed and paid the price. She had watched strong people grow thin, watched hope fade from their eyes as the winters grew harsher, and then came the men with papers. She remembered the way they spoke, calm and certain, as if what they were doing was nothing more than routine. They had not raised their voices, they had not needed to. The weight of what they carried was enough. She had tried to argue at first, tried to explain what the land meant, how long she had worked it, how much she had given to it. But words had not mattered. They never did in matters like that. What stayed with her most was not their words, but the way one of them had looked past her, as if she were already gone. The fire cracked again, pulling her back to the present. She opened her eyes and looked at the wheat. It was strange to think that something so fragile could be the center of all her hope now. A handful of plants growing in a cave, against everything she had ever known about farming. It felt almost like a quiet rebellion against the world that had pushed her out. She shifted slightly, her joints stiff, and reached for a small cup near the fire. Inside was a bit of melted snow. She took a careful sip, letting the cold water settle in her mouth before swallowing. Even that small act took effort now. The wind outside grew louder, rattling against the rocks at the cave's entrance. Snow followed, drifting in thin lines that caught the light of the fire before settling on the ground. She watched it for a while, the steady movement of it almost hypnotic. Then she heard something. It was faint, nearly lost beneath the sound of the wind. A soft scrape, like something shifting against stone. She froze, her hand tightening around the cup. The cave had been quiet since she found it. Too quiet, perhaps. She had told herself that meant it was safe, that nothing lived here. But now, as she listened, she was not so sure. The sound came again, a little clearer this time. She set the cup down slowly and reached for the small tool she kept nearby, gripping it tighter than she needed to. Her eyes moved toward the darker part of the cave, beyond the reach of the firelight. Shadows filled that space, thick and unmoving. For a moment nothing happened. Then the sound stopped. She stayed where she was, her breath shallow, listening for any sign of movement. The fire flickered, the wheat rustled faintly, and the wind howled outside. But from the darkness, there was nothing. After a while, she let out a slow breath, though the tension in her chest did not ease. It could have been the cave settling, or a small animal finding its way inside. That was what she told herself. Still, she did not take her eyes off the shadows. Time passed slowly after that. The fire burned lower, and she fed it with the last of the wood she had gathered earlier. Each piece felt more valuable now, harder to give up. She knew she would have to go out again soon into the cold to find more. The thought of it made her shoulders tighten. The wheat caught her attention again, its green color standing out against the dull tones of the cave. She crawled closer, studying the thin stems. They had grown a little more, she was sure of it, not much but enough to notice. She reached out carefully, brushing her fingers lightly over one of the leaves. It bent under her touch, then sprang back slowly, alive. A small, tired smile crossed her face. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine what it might be like if the wheat survived. If it grew strong enough to harvest, if it gave her even a little more time. It was a fragile thought, one that could break easily, but she held on to it anyway. The wind shifted suddenly, sending a stronger gust into the cave. The fire flickered wildly, and the shadows on the walls seemed to leap and twist. She turned her head toward the entrance, squinting against the rush of cold air. That was when she saw the tracks. At first they were hard to make out, half covered by fresh snow. But as she looked closer she could see them clearly. A line of marks leading toward the cave, uneven but distinct. Her heart began to pound. They were not hers. She pushed herself up slowly, ignoring the way her legs protested. Each step toward the entrance felt heavy, uncertain. The cold hit her face as she moved closer, sharp and biting. The tracks came from the open land beyond, disappearing into the white distance. Whoever had made them had come close. Close enough to find the cave? She stood there, staring at the marks, her mind racing. Out here, in a place like this, no one traveled without reason. The wind picked up again, and snow began to fall harder, already starting to cover the tracks. Soon they would be gone as if they had never been there at all. She turned back toward the cave, her gaze moving from the fire to the wheat, then to the shadows beyond. The sound she had heard earlier came back to her, sharper now in her memory. Whatever had made those tracks could still be near. She stepped back slowly, her grip tightening on the tool in her hand. The cave no longer felt as safe as it had before. The walls seemed closer, the shadows deeper. The wheat swayed gently behind her, unaware of the danger, still growing in its quiet, stubborn way. And as the storm outside closed in, sealing the world in snow, she realized that the winter might not be the only thing she had to survive. She did not sleep that night. The fire burned low and uneven, and every time it cracked, her body tensed as if expecting something to step out of the dark. She stayed close to the wheat, her back against the cold stone, her eyes moving again and again toward the deeper part of the cave. The shadows there seemed thicker now, less like empty space and more like something waiting. The tracks outside would be gone by morning? The snow had already begun to cover them, layer by layer, quiet and steady. But the knowing would remain. Someone had come close enough to find this place, close enough to leave a mark and walk away, or not walk away. She tightened her grip on the tool in her hand and listened. The wind had settled into a long, low howl that never fully stopped. Beneath it, the cave held its own silence, broken only by the faint rustle of wheat and the soft shift of burning wood. Then came the sound again. A scrape, slow and careful, deeper inside. Her breath caught. This time there was no mistaking it. It was not the cave settling. It was not the wind. Something was moving. She did not rush toward it. Every instinct told her to stay where she was, to guard the fire, to protect the only place that felt even slightly safe. But another part of her, the part that had kept her alive through loss and cold and hunger, knew that waiting without knowing was worse. She rose slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her. The cave seemed to stretch longer than before, the darkness pulling her forward even as she wanted to turn back. She lifted the lantern, shielding its small flame with her hand, and took a careful step. The light pushed against the dark, revealing rough stone, uneven ground, nothing more, another step. The sound stopped. She held still, listening so hard it made her head ache. Nothing answered her, no movement, no breath, no sign of life. It felt wrong. She took one more step, raising the lantern higher. The light flickered across the walls, catching on a narrow bend in the cave she had not explored before. It curved inward, leading to a space she had left untouched since the day she arrived. She had told herself there was no need to go farther, that the front of the cave was enough. Now she was not so sure. A faint mark on the ground caught her eye. She lowered the lantern, her heart beating faster. The dirt there looked disturbed, as if something had passed over it recently. Not just once, but more than once. She swallowed hard and backed away. Whatever was inside, it knew the cave better than she did. She returned to the fire quickly, her movements no longer slow or careful. The wheat brushed against her skirt as she passed, its soft touch grounding her for a brief second. She set the lantern down and fed another piece of wood into the flames, watching them rise with a mix of relief and fear. The fire was light. Light meant safety, at least a little, but it also meant she could be seen. That thought settled heavy in her chest. If someone had followed her, if those tracks belonged to a person and not an animal, then the glow from her fire would have been easy to spot against the snow. She turned toward the cave's entrance, staring out into the storm. The night was thick with falling snow, the world beyond reduced to shifting white and shadow. Anyone out there would have trouble moving, trouble seeing, but they had already come once. She moved quickly, gathering what little she had and pulling it closer to the fire, the sacks, the tools, the blanket. She even shifted a few stones, building a small barrier near the entrance, not enough to block it, but enough to make it harder for something to rush in unnoticed. Her hands shook as she worked. The cave no longer felt like a hidden place. It felt like something discovered. Hours passed, or maybe only minutes. Time had begun to lose its shape. She stayed awake, watching, listening, waiting for the sound to return. It did not. But the feeling of being watched did. By morning, the storm had eased, leaving the land outside buried under a thick, unbroken layer of snow. She stepped cautiously toward the entrance, her breath slow, her eyes scanning the ground. The tracks were gone. Not a single mark remained to prove what she had seen the night before. The snow lay smooth and untouched, stretching out in every direction. It would have been easy to believe she had imagined it all. Easy, but not true. She stepped back into the cave, her gaze moving toward the deeper shadows again. The memory of the disturbed earth lingered in her mind, sharper now in the quiet light of day. She could not ignore it. If something was living in the cave, she needed to know. If someone had found her, she needed to be ready. But fear held her in place. The wheat drew her attention again, its green color brighter in the daylight. It had grown a little more, the stems reaching higher, stronger than before. It was a small sign of progress, a quiet reminder that not everything was against her. She knelt beside it, brushing her fingers over the leaves. For a moment she let herself focus only on that. The simple act of tending to something alive. It steadied her breathing, gave her a reason to keep moving. She needed more than the wheat. Food would not last. Firewood would not last. And now, even the cave itself was uncertain. Her eyes moved toward the entrance again, toward the frozen land beyond. Going out meant facing the cold, the wind, the endless stretch of white. It meant risking her strength, which was already fading. Staying meant facing whatever might be hiding inside. Neither choice felt safe. She sat back slowly, her mind turning over every possibility. There had been stories, long before she lost her land, about people disappearing in winter. Travelers who never reached their destination. Settlers who wandered too far and never found their way back, and others who took what they needed to survive. The thought made her chest tighten. If someone else was out there, struggling against the same winter, they might not see her as a neighbor. They might see her as something else. The fire popped suddenly, sending a spark into the air. She flinched, her heart racing again. The tension had settled deep inside her now, making every small sound feel like a warning. She stood up slowly and looked once more toward the darker part of the cave. The bend in the rock seemed unchanged, quiet and still. But she knew what she had seen. The disturbed ground, the sound of movement, it was not empty. She took a step forward, then stopped. Not yet. She was not ready to face whatever might be there. Not without a plan, not without more strength. Instead, she turned back to the fire and began to prepare for the day. She would need more wood. Maybe even try to find something else to eat, though the chances were small in a winter like this. Before she left, she glanced once more at the wheat. It stood there, fragile but growing, holding on despite everything. She nodded to herself, a small, quiet decision forming in her mind. She would go out, she would gather what she could, and when she returned, she would face the darkness inside the cave, because whatever was hiding there was no longer just a fear. It was part of her fight to survive. The cold hit harder the moment she stepped outside. It wrapped around her like a weight, pressing into her chest and slowing her breath. The snow reached past her ankles, soft on the surface but heavy underneath, making each step take more effort than the last. She pulled her shawl tight and moved forward, keeping her eyes on the land ahead. The world had gone quiet after the storm. No birds, no distant movement, nothing but a wide stretch of white and the pale sky above. It made her feel small in a way she had not felt before, as if she could disappear out there and no one would ever know. She moved carefully along the edge of the hill, scanning for anything she could use. A fallen branch, a patch of dry grass, even a broken piece of wood carried by the wind. Every little thing mattered now. Every piece of fuel meant another hour of warmth, another chance to keep the wheat alive. Her legs trembled more than she liked. Hunger had taken its toll, and the cold made it worse. She paused once, leaning slightly against a rock, catching her breath. The cave was not far behind her, but it already felt like a distant place. Her eyes drifted across the snow again. At first she saw nothing. Then she noticed a faint dip in the surface, barely visible, as if something had passed through before the storm and left a trace beneath the fresh layer. She stepped closer, her heart beginning to beat faster. It was not clear enough to be certain. Just a slight unevenness, a line that did not match the natural shape of the land. But it was enough. She straightened slowly and looked farther out toward the low rise in the distance. For a moment she thought she saw movement. Something dark against the white, gone as quickly as it appeared. Her breath caught. She stayed still, watching, waiting for it to show again. Nothing came. The wind shifted lightly, brushing across the surface of the snow and smoothing it further. Whatever she had seen, if she had seen anything at all, was gone. She forced herself to move. Standing still would only let the cold sink deeper. She gathered what she could find, small branches half buried in snow, a piece of wood lodged against a rock, brittle grass frozen stiff. It was not much, but it was something. Her hands ached as she worked, the cold biting through her skin. She did not stop until her arms felt too heavy to lift. When she finally turned back toward the cave, the light had begun to fade. The sky dimmed slowly, turning from pale gray to a deeper shade that signaled the coming night. Her steps quickened despite her exhaustion. The thought of the cave, of the fire, of the wheat, pulled her forward. But something else followed close behind. The feeling had returned. Not just fear this time, but certainty. She was not alone out there. She did not look back. The cave came into view, a dark opening against the snow-covered hill. For a brief moment, relief washed over her. Then she saw it. The stones near the entrance had shifted. Not by much, just enough to be noticed. Her chest tightened. She had placed them carefully before leaving. Not to block the cave, but to mark it, to give herself a sense of control. Now they were out of place, one tilted slightly, another pushed aside. She stood frozen, the bundle of wood in her arms suddenly feeling too heavy. The fire inside still burned. She could see the faint glow from where she stood. Something had been there. Or still was. The cold no longer mattered. Neither did the weight in her arms. She stepped forward slowly, each movement measured, her eyes fixed on the entrance. The air near the cave felt different. Warmer, but not in a comforting way. She set the wood down quietly and reached for her tool, her grip tightening as she crossed the threshold. The fire crackled softly, just as she had left it. The wheat stood undisturbed, its green stems catching the firelight, swaying gently. For a brief moment she thought maybe she had been wrong. Maybe the stones had shifted on their own. Then she saw the ground. Near the edge of the firelight, just before the cave bent into darkness, the soil was marked again. Clearer this time, fresh, she took a slow step forward, her breath shallow. "Who's there?" she called, her voice steady but low. The words faded into the cave, swallowed by the stone. No answer came. But the silence felt heavier now. She moved closer to the bend, raising the tool slightly. The lantern sat where she had left it, and she grabbed it quickly, lifting it high to push the light deeper into the cave. The shadows pulled back just enough to reveal the narrow curve ahead. For a moment nothing moved. Then, from somewhere beyond the bend, came the faint sound of breathing. Not hers. She stopped. Every part of her wanted to turn and run, to leave the cave behind and face the cold instead. But something stronger held her there, the wheat, the fire. The last piece of shelter she had, she could not abandon it. Her voice came again, quieter this time. "I know you're there." The breathing shifted, almost like a response. Not words, not movement, just a change. The cave seemed smaller now, the walls pressing closer as she stood at the edge of the unknown. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure it could be heard. Another step. The lantern light stretched farther, brushing against the curve of the rock. A shape moved. It was quick, just a flicker, but enough to make her pull back slightly. Her grip tightened, her body bracing for something she could not yet see. The shape did not come forward. It stayed just beyond the reach of the light. A long moment passed, then another. The fire behind her cracked loudly, and she flinched, her focus breaking for a second. When she looked back toward the bend, the shape had shifted again, closer now. Her breath caught. The air between them felt heavy, filled with tension that neither of them broke. Whoever or whatever was there was watching her just as closely as she was watching it. Outside, the wind began to rise again, its howl slipping into the cave and wrapping around the silence. Snow followed, drifting in at the entrance, carried by the growing storm. She stood between two dangers now, the unknown in the dark, and the winter closing in behind her. The wheat swayed softly at her back, fragile but alive, a quiet reminder of what she was fighting for. Her hand steadied. "Step into the light," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. For a moment, nothing happened. Then slowly, the shape began to move forward. The lantern shook slightly in her hand, the light trembling as it reached out to meet whatever was coming. And as the figure drew closer, just at the edge where shadow met firelight, she realized that this moment would decide everything. The figure stepped forward slowly, careful, as if the light itself might harm it. She held the lantern steady, though her hand trembled and the glow finally reached a face. It was not what she expected, not a threat rushing at her. Not something wild and dangerous, just a person. Thin, worn, wrapped in layers that looked older than her own. The face was drawn, pale from the cold, eyes sunken but alert. There was caution there, and something else too. The same thing she had felt in herself for weeks, hunger. They both stood still, staring at each other, neither moving closer. "You've been here," she said quietly, her voice softer now. The stranger gave a slight nod, slow and careful. "Didn't mean to scare you," came the reply, rough from cold and lack of use. "I found the back of the cave. Been staying there." She let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. The tightness in her chest eased just a little, though her grip on the tool did not loosen yet. "You moved the stones?" she said. Another nod. "Saw your fire. Didn't know if you'd drive me out or not." The words settled between them, heavy but honest. She lowered the tool slightly. "I thought someone was following me." The strangers shook their head. "Been alone for a long time. Saw the smoke, that's all." For a moment neither of them spoke. The wind outside grew louder, pushing snow into the entrance again. The fire behind her cracked and shifted, the warmth reaching them both. She stepped back slowly, lowering the lantern just enough to soften the light. "Come closer," she said. "It's too cold to stand there." The stranger hesitated, then moved forward, step by careful step, until the firelight fully touched their face. Up close, the signs of winter were clearer. Chapped skin, shaking hands, the kind of exhaustion that went deeper than simple tiredness. They sat down across from the fire, leaving space between them at first. Her eyes moved briefly to the wheat, then back again. "You've been inside the cave all this time." "Not all," the stranger said. "Moving around, trying to find food. There's not much left out there." She gave a small, knowing nod. "I know." Silence returned, but it felt different now, less sharp, less uncertain. After a while, she reached for one of the small pieces of food she had left. She hesitated for only a second before breaking it in half and holding a piece out. The stranger looked at it, then at her as if unsure it was real. "Take it," she said. Slowly, carefully, they did. They ate in quiet, the fire between them, the storm pressing against the cave. It was not enough to fill the hunger, but it eased it just a little. When it was done, the stranger's eyes drifted to the wheat. "You grew that here?" they said, almost in disbelief. She followed their gaze. "I had to try. It was all I had left." "It's working," they said, leaning forward slightly. "I've never seen anything like it." "Neither have I," she admitted. "But it won't be ready in time." "Not at this pace." The words hung in the air, the truth of them hard to ignore. The stranger sat quietly for a moment, then spoke again. "There's another opening," they said, "back where I was staying. It's narrow, but it lets in a bit of light during the day. And less wind than the front." She looked at them, interest rising despite her fatigue. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" A faint, tired smile crossed their face. "Wasn't sure you'd want to share your cave?" She considered that, then gave a small shake of her head. "It's not just mine anymore." The decision came easier than she expected. Together, they moved deeper into the cave, the lantern lighting their way. The bend in the rock no longer felt as threatening, not with someone beside her. The ground showed signs of use now that she looked more closely. A small area cleared, a few scattered items, proof that the stranger had been surviving here in their own quiet way. The second opening was narrow, just as they had said, but it let in a faint stream of light, even in the heavy gray of winter. The air there felt different, less still. "It might help the wheat," the stranger said, "if we move some of it here, or make another patch." She nodded slowly, her mind already turning over the idea. And the smoke from the fire could find its way out easier. They worked carefully, shifting some of the soil, preparing a second place to plant. It was not easy, and both of them moved slowly, their strength limited. But together the work felt possible in a way it had not before. Hours passed without them noticing. When they returned to the main part of the cave, the fire had burned low again. She added more wood, watching the flames rise, and for the first time in days, the warmth felt like it might be enough. The storm outside raged on, but inside something had changed. Days turned into a rhythm. They took turns gathering what little they could from outside, always careful, always watching. They shared what they found, no matter how small. They spoke more, slowly at first, then with growing ease. Stories of land lost, of winters survived, of mistakes and small victories. The wheat became their focus. They tended it together, moving some of the plants to the second opening, adjusting the soil, watching how the light touched it. The growth was still slow, but it was stronger now. The green deepened, the stems thickened just a little. It gave them something to hold on to. The hunger did not disappear, and the cold did not ease quickly. There were still nights when the wind felt like it might tear the world apart. Still mornings when their bodies felt too heavy to move, but they kept going. One morning, the light in the cave felt different. She noticed it first, standing near the second opening. It was brighter, clearer, carrying a softness that had not been there before. She stepped closer, her breath catching slightly. Outside, the snow still covered the ground, but the sky held a faint hint of blue. "Come look," she called. The stranger joined her, both of them standing in the narrow opening, staring out at the land. Winter was not gone, but it was shifting. The wheat behind them rustled softly, taller now, stronger than it had any right to be. She turned back to it, a slow smile forming on her face. "We made it this far," she said quietly. The stranger nodded. "We'll make it the rest of the way." She believed that now, not because the land had changed, not because the world had suddenly become kind, but because she was no longer facing it alone. The cave that had once been a place of fear had become something else. A shelter, a chance, a small piece of land carved out of stone and stubborn hope. She knelt beside the wheat, running her fingers lightly over the green leaves. Each one was a promise, not just of survival, but of something more. A future. The wind outside softened, carrying with it the first quiet signs of change. And inside the cave, where nothing should have grown, life had taken hold and refused to let go.